The ancient and esoteric Order of the Jackalope is a secret society devoted to a simple idea. That which is least known is best to know. Each episode, one of our initiates finds some strange story or amazing fact to share with you. No topic is off limits, except for the obvious. Jackass Forever, presented by Number 13. What's that? You've never heard of the legend of Joe Magarac? Well, take a seat by the fire. I think I have some environmental audio of a crackling fire around here. Oh, there it is. Well, let's get you up to speed. Our story takes place in southwestern Pennsylvania over 100 years ago, at the dawn of the 20th century. At that time, industry was king, and steel mills lined the Monongahela Valley as far as the eyes could see. Admittedly, that wasn't very far, because the air was also filled with a thick black soot that got into everything, your clothes, your hair, and your lungs. It was an ugly and dangerous byproduct of an ugly and dangerous industry. A steel mill was a harsh employer. They treated men like they were beasts and drove them until they were broken. Low pay and hazardous working conditions were the norm. If you were lucky, you might get to retire before your body broke down. If you were unlucky, well, at least the funeral would be cheap because there wouldn't be much of a body left. And yet, people came from all over the world to do that hard work. Hungarians, Magyars, Romanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, Croats, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians all flocked to the Mon Valley to scratch out their patch and earn a better life for their children. This is the story of those brave immigrants, especially the ones who lived in Hunkytown, high up in the steep hills, where you might get a little fresh air and a few rays of sun a few times each year. The good people of Hunkytown had somehow managed to build a happy life out of a place everyone else thought of as hell on earth. And none of them was happier than Mary Mestrovich. Mary was the prettiest girl in all of Hunkytown, prettier than the hunky girls back home in the old country, prettier than the big city girls in Pittsburgh, prettier than any other girl in the whole world, if I'm being honest. She had eyes as blue as the flame of a blowtorch, cheeks redder than a hot iron ingot, and silky hair the color of molten steel. She was polite and sweet and could dance the polka better than anyone. Every boy in Hunkytown dreamed of making her his wife, and now she was 18 and ready to marry. The only obstacle was Mary's father, Steve Mestrovich. Steve was the best cinder man in the whole Mon Valley, and he wasn't going to let just anyone marry his sweet little girl. No, Mary's husband would have to be a hard worker and a good provider, and that meant he would have to be strong. Not just strong, but stronger than Steve himself. Possibly even the strongest man in the whole world. But how to find such a man? Fortunately, Steve Mestrovich was as clever as he was strong, so he threw a party. People came from all over just to see what he was up to. They came from Homestead and Braddock and Monessen and Duquesne and even from Johnstown. They gorged themselves on cabbage rolls, pierogies, and sweet cakes, and washed them all down with copious amounts of beer and prune jack. Once they were all good and drunk, Steve Mestrovich herded them into a nearby barn and whipped away a tarp to reveal 3 dolly bars he had brought home from the mill, one weighing 350 pounds, one weighing 500 pounds, and one weighing 900 pounds. Then he declared he would give Mary's hand in marriage to anyone who could lift the 3 bars. Every unmarried man lined up to take their chances. Well, to a steelworker, a 350-pound dolly bar is nothing. They could all lift it over their head with no problem, except for a few men from Homestead, boys really, who protested that they hadn't had a proper breakfast that morning. Everyone pretended to agree just so they could save face. They were good boys, but everyone knew their steel was weak. It was the 500-pound dolly bar that really separated the men from the boys. Only 3 men made it through that round: Andy Dombrowski from Johnstown, Ilya Stanosky from Homestead, and Pete Pusick from Hunkytown. That 900-pound dolly bar, though, Eli Stanosky couldn't budge it and broke both of his arms in the attempt. Andy Dombrowski went next, and he couldn't move it either. The crowd loved that because it finally proved 2 things: that the steel mills in Johnstown were weaker than the coffee mills down in Pittsburgh, and that the best man in Johnstown was no better than the worst man in Hunkytown. Of course, they were all cheering for Pete Pusick, the hometown favorite, who had been making goo-goo eyes at Mary Mestrovich ever since he was 14. Except even Pete could barely budge the 900-pound dolly bar. He grunted and groaned for minutes, but could only manage to get it an inch off the floor before he passed out from the strain, still holding the bar. Steve Mestrovich was stumped. His test had failed. Who was going to take his daughter's hand in marriage now? Then the barn door burst open, and he walked in. How to possibly describe him? He was tall, so tall that even in the barn he had to stoop down so he didn't bump his head on the rafters. And he was huge, too. His wrists and ankles were thicker than your waist. His neck was like a tree trunk. His back was broader than the gates down at the mills. His sheer bulk was accentuated by his ridiculous outfit, because he was wearing the largest clothes you could possibly buy, but stretched them out so much he looked like an adult crammed into a child's suit. What showed through the bursting seams was not flesh at all, but shiny metal, as if he were a man literally made of steel. The big steel man took one look at what was going on, rolled up his sleeves, and then lifted both Pete Pusick and the 900-pound dolly bar clear over his head. Then, just for good measure, he took the dolly bar and bent it into a tight little pretzel. He was nice enough to put Pete to the side first, which showed he was kind as well as strong. Then he walked over to the refreshments, drank down a keg of beer like it was a pint glass, and started housing cabbage rolls like they were going out of style. Steve Mestrovich gingerly approached the big man to ask him who he was, and he took a moment from swinging a jug of prune jack to tell him.
They call me Joe Magarac. They call me that because all I know is how to eat and work like a donkey. I was born in an ore mountain in the old country, and I come to U.S.A. to work in the steel mill because I am the only genuine steel man in the whole world.
And then he clunked his chest, which rang out like a solid steel rail, just to prove his point. Well, that was all Steve Mestrovich needed to hear. He told Joe Magarac that he was clearly the strongest man in the world, and he had won his daughter's hand in marriage. When he heard that, though, Joe went white as a sheet and apologized. He hadn't known what the contest was for, or he wouldn't have entered. He couldn't marry anyone. All he wanted to do was work and eat. Really, just work, to be honest. He only ate because it made other people uncomfortable when he didn't. Steve should probably just give Mary's hand to the runner-up. That was fine by Mary, who had been making goo-goo eyes at Pete Pusick ever since she was 14, and would have probably just eloped with him if her father hadn't come up with this harebrained stunt in the first place. She and Pete got married that night. Steve Mestrovich was fine with that, because the only genuine steel man in the whole world was now working for him down at the mill, and he was the best worker anyone could have asked for. Joe Magarac could stick his hands right into the furnace to check the temperature. Then he could go over to a ladle full of melted steel, stir it, and slop it into ingot molds with his bare hands. He could make the prettiest steel rails you ever saw, 8 at a time, by squeezing fistfuls of red-hot steel between his fingers. And he would work a 12-hour shift without complaint, then would clock out and clock right back in, working back-to-back-to-back-to-back-to-back-to-back shifts. The other workers complained that Joe was putting them out of work by doing all of it himself. They would have made a bigger deal of it, except he had saved all of their lives multiple times by stopping runaway barges, throwing up impromptu catwalks in the blink of an eye to catch them when they fell, riding a tilting ladle that was about to spill 24 tons of molten steel like he was some sort of asbestos atlas. They weren't the only ones complaining either. The owners complained that Joe's diet, which involved biting down on ingots like they were bread and drinking molten slag like it was soup, was costing them money. They weren't on board with his hygiene habits either, which involved just walking into the furnace to let all the soot burn off his body. Our insurance companies hated that. Steve wound up getting Joe a room in a nearby boarding house, though Joe didn't spend much of his time there. Instead, he took simultaneous double shifts at steel mills up and down the river. When the workers at those mills complained too, he started spending his free time competing in steelmaking competitions. Once he won a steelmaking race with Gary from Gary and beat him by more than 3,000 pounds even though he had let the Hoosier get a 3-day head start. Joe was impressed. That was the closest anyone had ever come to beating him. The mill owner from Gary was also impressed and offered Joe a job for more pay. Joe refused because if he moved to a new city, he would have to stop working while he relocated. During World War I, Joe single-handedly made so much steel that he offset the lost output from every other steel worker who had been drafted. The government tried to pin a medal on his chest for that, but they couldn't find a pin that wouldn't bend on his steel skin. But eventually it all caught up with Joe Magarac. He made so much steel that there was a tremendous oversupply. The mills were shut down and all the workers furloughed until the warehouses emptied out. Everyone blamed Joe, but not too much, again because he had saved all of their lives. Besides, they could use the time off to spend quality time with their wives, sweethearts, and children. Not Joe Magarac, though. He didn't have a wife or sweetheart or children. All he had was work. Literally. He hadn't even slept or eaten in 15 years because he was so busy working. After a few days of forced idleness, he went crazy. That day there was a great noise in the mill, and Steve and Pete and all the workers ran down to see that Joe had started it back up again and was melting himself down in the furnace. They begged him to stop, but Joe declared that all a Magarac can do is eat and work, and at least this way he would die doing what he loved. They all doffed their hats and shed a tear as Joe's head melted away. The last thing they saw was the big smile on his face, until that too melted into nothingness. And I gotta tell you, that last batch of steel Joe Magarac made from himself was the finest steel ever made. Now, I'm hardly surprised you haven't heard of Joe Magarac before. Hardly anyone outside of Pittsburgh had before November 1931. That was the month Scribner's magazine ran an article by Owen Francis called The Saga of Joe Magarac, Steelman. Owen Francis was born in the Mon Valley and was employed as a steelworker until 1917, when he got drafted by Uncle Sam and sent overseas to fight the Kaiser. In France, he inhaled a lungful of mustard gas, and during his long recovery, he began to reconsider the life choices that had brought him there. Francis decided he would become a world-famous screenwriter, which was easier said than done. He moved to California and spent years taking night classes and working odd jobs before he managed to sell a single script to Warner Brothers. It was the only script he ever managed to sell. When the money ran out, he had to move back to Pittsburgh. That move proved to be a fortuitous one. Francis drew inspiration from the mines and mills of his youth and the stories of the men who worked there, and used that to launch a career as a magazine feature writer. The Saga of Joe Magarac, Steelman was his first big break.
I find that Joe Magarac is a man living only in the imagination of the hunky steel mill worker. He is to the hunky what Paul Bunyan is to the woodsman and old Stormalong is to the man of the sea. With his active imagination and his childlike delight in tales of greatness, the hunky has created stories with Joe Magarac as the hero that may in the future become the folklore of our country. Conceived in the minds of hunky steel mill workers, he belongs to the mills as do the furnaces and rolling mills. The Saga of Joe Magarac is more typical of the hunky than any tale or incident or description I might write. It shows his sense of humor, his ambitions, his love of work, and in general, shows what I know the hunky to be, a good-natured, peace and home-loving worker.
The finished article is more or less the story from the beginning of the episode. It also gives you a good idea of why Francis's literary career never took off. The prologue is overlong, self-serving, and more than a little patronizing. The actual story is poorly paced, jumping from the beginning right to the end with no middle. What is there is barely readable, with all the dialogue presented in a thick dialect that is nearly indecipherable. Francis contributed a few more articles to Scribner's between 1931 and 1935, mostly more Joe Magarac tales where he rescues steelworkers from certain death and defeats other similarly endowed paragons of labor in outrageous contests. After that, he vanished without a trace. And so did Joe Magarac, who was quickly forgotten everywhere but Pittsburgh. Then, during World War II, the United Steel Company made Joe Magarac the focus of their advertising. He was plastered on ads and posters and promoted as a hero, a tireless company man who thought only of how to make American industry better so we could finally stick it to Hitler, Tojo, and Mussolini. Almost overnight, Joe Magarac went from an obscure figure to a genuine American icon. United Steel published educational comics where a surprisingly fey Genie of Steel uses his magic powers to teach children about the steelmaking process. Irwin Shapiro's Joe Magarac and his U.S.A Citizen Papers recast the tale as a modern-day fable, adding an action-packed coda where Magarac turns into a giant monster and goes on a rampage to teach nativist bigots the value of immigration. Jules Billard's slightly more sophisticated retellings of the stories reached millions of readers in the pages of the Saturday Evening Post. Naturally, Pittsburgh was the center of this Magarac mania. A relief of Joe Magarac and his coal mining cousin Jan Volcanic stared down at travelers from atop the Manchester Bridge. His feats were depicted on murals in the Carnegie Museum of Art, on rides at the Kennywood Amusement Park, and in countless WPA projects. Every steel mill tried to claim Magarac as their own, at least until a larger-than-life-size statue was installed in front of the Edgar Thompson Steelworks in Braddock. William Gropper's painting of Joe bending a piece of bar stock with his bare hands won a public opinion poll and was declared best in show at Gimbel's 1947 Pennsylvania art exhibit, despite being one of the most grotesque things you've ever seen. It didn't take long for the Joe-mentum to falter, though. Walt Disney announced that Magarac would be featured in a series of shorts based on American folk tales, putting him in the exalted company of Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill, but nothing ever came out of that other than a few concept drawings. Megalomaniacal sculptor Frank Vitor's proposal to Cap Point State Park with a 100-foot-tall sculpture of Joe Magarac hoisting 2 ladles of molten steel was rejected by Pittsburgh's Planning Commission, which went with a more traditional fountain instead. And then in 1953, Hyman Richmond brought it all crashing down. Richmond was an amateur folklorist from Pittsburgh, and he was sick of talking about Joe Magarac. Whenever he went to conferences, that was all anyone wanted to talk about. Where did Joe Magarac come from? What other Joe Magarac tales did he know? Joe this, Magarac that. The problem was that Hyman Richmond had never heard of Joe Magarac before, and it was driving him nuts. He decided to get to the bottom of this whole Magarac business. Fortunately, his day job was with the Department of Labor, which gave him the opportunity to interview immigrant steelworkers all over Pittsburgh. And what he discovered was that none of them had heard of Joe Magarac before either. They didn't know him in Pittsburgh, they didn't know him in Homestead, they didn't know him in Braddock or Elizabeth or Clareton. The Hungarians didn't know him, the Croats and Serbs didn't know him, the Swedes and Poles and Lithuanians didn't know him. There were tales of Bunyan-esque characters like Henry Palm, Armstrong Joe, and Mike Lesnovich, living man-mountains who could tie bar stock into knots with their bare hands, but that was where those stories began and ended. There certainly weren't any mythic narratives like the Joe Magarac stories in circulation, much less any sort of complicated and layered tale like the courtship of Mary Mestrovich. The suits at United Steel didn't know much about him either. They knew even less about him than their employees, if that was even possible. Richmond was confused, so he wrote to the authors who had published stories about Joe Magarac to see what their sources were. It turns out they had never heard of Joe Magarac either before reading the November 1931 issue of Scribner's. Before that date, there was no mention of Joe Magarac in print anywhere. Next, he turned a critical eye to the works of Owen Francis in the hopes that he would turn up some sort of lead. In the process, he discovered some weird inconsistencies. For instance, in the Saga of Joe Magarac, it is claimed that Magarac is the Hungarian word for jackass, and that it is a compliment that means you are a hard worker. It does mean jackass, but it's Croatian and not Hungarian, and it is anything but a compliment. Interviewee Steve Burko even told Richmond to be careful throwing the word around because
You can call someone that and they'll beat your head in.
the more Richmond thought about Joe Magarac, the more confused he got. Who exactly was he supposed to be an aspirational figure for? Sure, lots of people wanted to be big and strong, but Magarac was also dumb as a rock. Why would anyone want to be a mindless robot who worked 24/7, 365 without ever taking a break to rest or play? Someone who had no interest in woman or prune jack or cabbage rolls, who didn't care about his wages or safety concerns or the well-being and employment of his fellow workers. A man who literally threw himself into the furnace when he could no longer work. There were possibilities. Maybe Joe Magarac was a satirical figure created by workers to make fun of what management demanded of them. Or maybe he was an aspirational figure created by management to promote their vision of the ideal worker. Maybe he was a joke played on Owen Francis by some steel workers who were sick of answering his questions. Or maybe Owen Francis had just made the whole story up on his own. Too bad no one could ask Owen Francis, because he had vanished from the face of the earth. In the end, Richmond decided that Joe Magarac was not authentic folklore, but fakelore, created by a down-on-his-luck writer to sell magazines, and perpetuated by the steel industry as a public relations stunt. His advice was simple.
The best thing anyone can do with the Joe Magarac story is forget it.
It was hardly a new conclusion. It is now widely accepted that Pecos Bill is not an authentic cowboy legend, but invented by Tex O'Reilly in 1917. Most of the Paul Bunyan legends were invented by logging company publicists or are Bowdlerized versions of much less savory tales. Why should Joe Magarac be any different? There were those who fought back, though. Poet U.S.A claimed he could prove that there was a real-life Joe Magarac, a Hungarian shepherd who emigrated to America in the 1850s and who was famous less as a hardworking Pittsburgh steelman and more as a union-busting brawler from New York who whipped mills into shape. When actually pressed, Seke could provide no actual evidence, and Richmond easily debunked his claims. Let's face it, though, Joe Magarac is never going to make it up there with Paul Bunyan and John Henry in the S tier of classic American folk heroes. He's lucky to be down there in the C tier with the other has-beens and never-wases like Captain Stormalong and Mose the Valiant Fireman, neither of whom I had heard of before I started researching this episode. Pittsburghers did try to keep the legend of Joe Magarac alive, but when the steel industry collapsed in the 1970s and 1980s, he was forgotten once more. Today, some locals may know the name, but they've never heard the stories. Perhaps the clearest sign of Magarac's fall from grace is that when the Steelers finally chose a mascot in 2007, they opted for a generic new character named Steely McBeam. Pittsburghers have new icons now. One of those icons can be found a stone's throw from Heinz Stadium, where the structural footings of the old Manchester Bridge can be found on the banks of the Ohio River. Once the bridge they supported was emblazoned with an image of Joe Magarac, but now those footings serve as a pedestal for a truly beloved and enduring local legend. Mr. Rogers. Key sources for this episode include Owen Francis's The Saga of Joe Magarac's Steelman, Jennifer Gilley and Stephen Burnet's Deconstructing and Reconstructing Pittsburgh's Man of Steel, reading Joe Magarac against the context of the 20th century steel industry, Kevin J. Patrick's Joe Magarac in the Spirit of Pittsburgh, and Marshal W. Fishwick's Sons of Paul, Folklore or Fakelore. What I really recommend, though, is Irwin Shapiro's Joe Magarac and his U.S.A Citizen Papers. The dialect is charming instead of grating, the location and period authentic detail helps keep everything grounded, the jokes are actually funny, and the moral is still relevant today. And on top of that, you have some really powerful illustrations by James Daugherty. 5 stars, A+, would read again. Connections! If you want another Fakelore story from Pittsburgh, why not go hear about how the Curtis Candy Company definitely didn't drop Baby Ruth candy bars on downtown, which we talked about in Death from Above by Chocolate. That's all for now, initiates. Come back in 3 weeks to join us for our landmark 100th episode, appropriately entitled Nothing But a Number. See you soon. This episode was produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope, and That's Not Canon Productions. A transcript, list of sources, links, and more can be found on our website, orderofthejackalope.com. That's orderofthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Our show is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. Our theme song is Drama D by Scott Roosh. Do you have thoughts about this episode? Why not share them on our Discord server? There's a link in the show notes. Or reach out to us on social media. We can be found at Order Jackalope on most platforms. Or just send us an old-fashioned email at jackalope@orderofthejackalope.com. We want you to join our secret society. All you have to do is share your strange story or amazing fact with the world. Visit our website and click Join Us for more information. Until next time, Quicquid minime sciat, optime scire.
A That's Not Canon Productions podcast.